On. We're back for another video. So last week we talked about DNA testing and whatnot, and this week I want to kind of follow up on that and see what do we have about dopamine. What is dopamine? How does it even link to? Can we see something in DNA tests about like dopamine and stuff? Because we do know it's quite important neurotransmitter. So do you want to open up about like an introduction to dopamine? Like what even is that? Because I personally see a lot of social media posts about, hey, you need to do this and that to increase your dopamine release, and so on and so forth. But more often than not, I don't think people even understand what it is. And they are trying to reach for a supplement to improve something they don't even understand.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you're 100% right. Like dopamine is definitely always talked about as like, oh, it's a reward hormone. Like that's the most common way that people try to understand what dopamine is, that it's a reward hormone or a motivation hormone and something along those lines. And the truth is it has a little bit of influence on that, but not by itself. In other words, dopamine, if you make a lot of dopamine or take a lot of dopamine, like through a medication like Adderall or Ritalin or any of these methamphetamine derived dopamine type drugs, you're creating excess. Anytime there's an excess of dopamine, you cleave that into adrenaline and noradrenaline. Those are what's making you motivated, if you want to call it that. Those are the ones that are making you move. Those are the ones that are making you take action. Dopamine is not really doing that, but it can easily be turned into those when you have excess. Dopamine is actually more of a pattern recognition and timing hormone. Everything that we've ever talked about on this podcast is basically our effort to tell you and show you that everything in your body is working on a timing mechanism, right? Everything has its proper time to be created and its proper time to be turned off. And if you're not following proper timing in your body at a biological level, then things are off. Digestion might be off, brain activity might be off, and other hormones will start to become off. Other daytime hormones versus nighttime hormones start to be shifted, right? So dopamine's role in this is more of a fine-tuning mechanism of timing at the nervous system level. Meaning, the best way that I like to describe this is the following. Dopamine is everywhere in the body, but there's certain parts in your body that have the most amount of dopamine, right? And number one, in the gut, there's a lot of dopamine created in the gut. And number two would be in the brain. And then number three is other skeletal muscles that require a very tuned amount of pattern recognition. One of those a lot of people don't know about is your calves, your Achilles tendon, all of that. That's what keeps you upright as a bipedal ape. As a human, you have way more dopamine in your calves than any other skeletal muscle on your body compared to every other animal on the planet. The reason for that is you walk on two legs. That requires an immense amount of nervous system coordination. If your brain had to do all of the coordinating to, let's say, for example, you just get up out of bed and you stand up, just standing up requires all of the muscles in your foot to fire correctly, all of the muscles in your ankle, all the muscles in your calf, and so on to fire 100% correctly. And not only that, every time you take a step, those have to re-coordinate and readapt to the pattern that you're doing. Your brain isn't actually doing much of that. That's all at the neuronal level, locally at the calves. In other words, the high amount of dopamine present there allows the neurons to recognize patterns and adjust patterns on the fly without having to send a signal to the brain and then back. You see what I'm saying? The brain will dictate rough movement, right? Like I can jump really hard. Yeah, that's going to take brain power. But just standing up and going for a walk, that takes very little brain power as far as neurological coordination. Most of that's being done locally at the local neurons in the calf. And that is dopamine's job, right? So other things like that will be things like certain sports, golf, for example, that requires a lot of three-dimensional visualization and spacing of, hey, I'm taking into account the wind, I'm taking into account the slope of the hill that it's going to land on, the slope that I'm on, etc. You have to take it to all of these things, and then you have to go through a 3D model, essentially, in your brain to figure out how you're going to strike the ball and where it should land. That type of brain power requires a lot of dopamine as well, because you're trying to piece together certain patterns and algorithms to flow for something that hasn't happened yet. You see what I'm saying? So dopamine is something that actually creates vision, and at the same time, in the physical world creates coordination of all of your body, right? Like when this golf example, for example, once you kind of have visualized what's going to happen, now you have to actually coordinate your body to make that flow happen, right? That is a dopamine response that you need. The more dopamine you have in that scenario, the more successful you're going to be at not only recreating that visualization, but fine tuning it as you go, because you're going to notice the difference between, oh, if my wrist is twisted a millimeter this way, it's off and I can tell. If it's twisted a millimeter the other way, it's in the perfect position and I can tell, right? The ability to tell the difference between force production with 1 millimeter turn or a 2 millimeter turn, that is solely dependent on your level of dopamine. Somebody, like, for example, if you're trying to, and again, we've taught people how to lift weights and how to do that. And you teach them, oh, if you move your wrist just a little bit this way, you're going to feel it a little bit more over here. And you get them to do that, but they don't really feel it. Like that happens a lot, where you get them to do it correctly, it's visually looking correctly, but they don't feel it where it's supposed to be feeling until like a day or two later that they've done it. And they're like, oh yeah, I can clearly tell a difference now. That is dopamine production, right? People that can tell motor unit patterning and like fine tuning the way that they move very, very easily, they have high levels of dopamine both in their muscles and in their brain that allows them to recreate motor patterns very easily. People with very low dopamine actually struggle with that same thing. One of the first things that they might struggle with is actual balance. Because, for example, if you close your eyes, now you're taking away one of the senses, right, of balance that allows the brain to do the work. But if you have high amount of dopamine in your calves and in your skeletal muscles, you don't need your eyes to walk around. You don't need your eyes to balance. But people with low amounts of skeletal muscle dopamine, if you take away their eyes, boom, their balance goes to crap. They get wobbly, and because they're dependent too much on the brain to do all of their movement processing and not enough dopamine at the local engines, if you want to call them.
It's interesting you bring it up because one of my favorites for somebody to build up their deadlift strengths is make them train with closed eyes.
Yeah, yeah, because you have to physically get in tune with where the force vectoring is coming from being able to put the force from your glutes into the ground and then still keep tension on the bar, right? Like that's like as simple as the deadlift is, you're just picking it up. It's actually probably one of the most complex movements to get right if you have a low dopamine state, because you will feel like every single rep is a different rep. You see what I'm saying? And when you have a high level of dopamine, you actually end up seeking repetitiveness. You end up seeking, oh, this movement, this exact position that I'm in feels exactly like this other one that I did. And now you can recreate it, and you start recreating it more and more, and you start to become more fluid. That is the role of dopamine, is the ability to find success. When you find success, what did it actually feel like, both mentally, physically, emotionally, and motor pattern wise? And now you're able to recreate it. It's what creates motor unit engrams, right? So that's how important dopamine is.
I can link it to, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when people start working out for bodybuilding purposes, and they usually go, you need to get muscle mind connection, but like there is no muscle to feel. The more muscle you have built, it's easier to connect with your muscle actually. So when I usually start out, it's like, I'm not going to care how you lift until you build some kind of tissue that you can feel something, because more often than not, you, first of all, so undertrained. No matter how much I try to explain you what to feel, you're not going to feel anything because there is nothing to feel to begin with. And correct me if I'm wrong, is there more dopamine available if you have more muscle mass?
Potentially, yes, potentially. It depends on the environment that you're exposing that muscle mass to, and we'll get to that a little bit here in just a moment.
So
So
follow on that, can you go through very beginning and just explain how exactly is dopamine created? What do we need?
right, yeah,
What
it's probably the
nutrients
best
do we
place to
need?
start now.
What habits do we need to have in place? Maybe there is some supplement that can help with enhancing dopamine creation in humans, and so on and so forth.
Yes, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen real quick, and we'll go from there. So this is the dopamine gene pathway, right? So it starts up here. Now, these are obviously phenylalanine and tyrosine. I have shown this slide much more simplistically in a different place, but at the end of the day, these are amino acids. We've talked about them, and the first thing they need to do is they have to be turned into L-DOPA right here in the middle. Nitric oxide is one of the key things that's going to essentially disassemble phenylalanine and tyrosine to be able to be turned into this. Okay, if that first step isn't happening, it doesn't mean that there aren't other things that will help transform this, right? For example, the amount of serotonin will change a little bit of this. BH4, which is a ketone, right? Everybody's kind of familiar with ketones from the keto diet and carnivore diet, but ketones will influence tyrosine and phenylalanine. So there are secondary things. It doesn't mean that you're not going to create any dopamine when you don't get any nitric oxide, but nitric oxide is the leading thing that's going to cause it. And here's another very important thing is nitric oxide is locally created, right? So meaning when you expose your skin or a body part to cold or sunlight, UVA light, locally in that area is where dopamine will be created. That's very important to understand. You're going to, so for example, if I had, if I was fully closed and only my arms were exposed, only my arms are going to create nitric oxide. So only in my arms will I have an excess amount of dopamine be created from these amino acids, not everywhere, right? So my face will have that, my arms will have that. And the more clothes you have off, the more nitric oxide you're going to create, and the more dopamine you have everywhere in musculoskeletal tissue, which comes to your point. If you have a lot of muscle and you happen to go outside and create a lot of nitric oxide, and you're obviously having a high protein diet and have plenty of phenylalanine and tyrosine, you are going to create a lot more dopamine than somebody who's smaller than you, just by surface area alone.
So does this is this how we have these studies showing that, hey, the more physically active you are, the less likely you are to suffer from any kind of psychological disorders and so on and so forth?
Yeah, there's a couple things there, right? So this is one of them, right? This is one of them. You will physically be able to create more dopamine, right? And that dopamine never gets wasted, just so that people understand. If you make an excess of it, it's going to turn into adrenaline and noradrenaline and facilitate more physicalness, more activity, right? And dopamine can also go backwards. It can go backwards into melanin, right? A lot of people don't know that melanin can be turned directly into dopamine. That's why I say UV light and nitric oxide are the key components that are going to make it from the raw materials of phenylalanine and tyrosine. But you can create dopamine backwards from adrenaline and noradrenaline and from melanin. So if you have a lot of melanin, you can also, anytime you get stressed, you will create a lot of dopamine just from the act of being stressed, and your body will downregulate melanin into dopamine. So again, that's also a surface area thing. If you are bigger and you have more melanin, you're going to be able to create more dopamine. And the studies that you're referencing, those are twofold. One, you have more muscle, you have more surface area, more of these actions will happen whenever you're in the right environment. Number two, you have more muscle. That means you have been innervating that muscle, meaning you've been creating more neurons, more dendrites to connect to that extra muscle that you've been building. You've literally expanded your brain, right? Because your nerves are connected to your brain. They're connected to your spinal cord, and your spinal cord is connected to your brain. There's no like firewall, right? There's no separation between your brain and your nerves. So if you think about that for a minute, people with low muscle mass have poor brain development outside of their skull. That's the way that again, that's not being demeaning. That means you have very much less neurons and neurotransmitters and nerves because you don't have that much skeletal muscle tissue to have to innervate. Now, that costs you something, right? Every time you make more muscle, your metabolic rate is going to go up. It's not as much as most people make it out to be, but it does cost you more because that more muscle tissue needs more mitochondria, needs more infrastructure. One of those infrastructures is the nerves themselves that are going to control that bigger muscle tissue. So you have bigger muscle tissue, more dopamine being created locally. More dopamine being created locally means that neurons and nerves in that muscle tissue are now able to control that muscle better and feed back feed back to the brain at even a faster rate. So yeah, simply put, and again, there is a point. There's probably some level where too much muscle tissue is too much muscle tissue. We all kind of see that in terms of longevity. There's no denying that. But in general, the general rule is you want as much muscle tissue as you can naturally hold for as long as possible because of this dopamine creation effect, which, by the way, is the cause of dementia. Dementia is a problem with dopamine creation. That we know that for a fact. Alzheimer's is a problem with blood sugar, or they're calling it type 3 diabetes at the nervous system level, at the neuron level, at the brain, right? So things that influence both of those is UV light and infrared light. Infrared light influences the nervous system in a way of electrical conductivity and also the blood sugar thing, because infrared light lowers blood sugar up to 30 to 40% just from one exposure of 30 minutes of red light therapy. That's in a lab, right? Imagine what happens out in sunlight. It reduces it dramatically. Now, I know that for a fact because I work with type 1 diabetics, and anytime that they're outside, they sometimes go hypo if they use their normal dosages that they would when they're inside all the time. And the reason for that is because infrared light literally makes you more insulin sensitive. AKA, if you're doing that regularly, especially on your head, you're going to offset a lot of the risks that happen with Alzheimer's. And if you're outside in sunlight, right, you're getting UV light also combined with that infrared light, which is going to create the dopamine production to really ramp up. And that also means that neurons and neurotransmitters are not going to be clipped, because that's another thing that people got to understand. Too much dopamine at the brain level, so that, because some people might get the idea, oh, well, if all I need is dopamine, I'll just take some Adderall, or I'll just take some Ritalin, the synthetic versions of dopamine. Those are problematic because those are active immediately and they cross the blood-brain barrier when you take the drug. Too much dopamine in the brain is going to clip neurons, meaning you start to simplify connections, because that's also the role of dopamine, right? Like, for example, I stated earlier, the difference between a 1 millimeter twist on your wrist and a 2 millimeter twist, one's right and one's wrong. Your body doesn't want to recreate the wrong one, right? So when there's a lot of dopamine, meaning you did it wrong and you kind of get mad, right? Like, because that's essentially the scenario. There's a feedback scenario going on there. When you do a movement wrong and you know that it's wrong and you felt that it's wrong, dopamine actually gets spiked a little bit, and that clips that neuron, meaning we don't want to do that anymore. So it clips that particular engram. And then when you hit it right again, that gives you a slightly different dopamine response. And then that's the path that the neuron wants to take all the time. You see what I mean? So dopamine, as far as a pattern recognition hormone, the way it's doing that is by pruning, essentially. That's actually what it's called, neuron pruning. So just like a tree, you're trying to get it shaped in a very specific way. So you start pruning things that you don't want, and you only start keeping the things you want. So taking exogenous dopamine, if you don't know what you're doing, may be clipping neurons that you don't want to clip. You could call it killing brain cells if you want to. I don't really call it that, because that's not what it's doing. It's just pruning neurons, and you may inadvertently be pruning prematurely, right?
We just basically explained how learning happens. So
yeah,
keep doing it
exactly.
over and over again until it kind of becomes autonomous, ultra instinct, so to speak, movement.
Yeah. That is when you've created a high level of dopaminergic response, not everywhere, but in a very specific pathway of neuron movement. And that is when it finally starts to get ingrained and become, like you said, autonomous, right? And so that's essentially the role that you want to do when you're doing any kind of training or any kind of studying, right? Like, you want to first off, learning something new doesn't just have to do with dopamine. It has to do with the actual setup of, hey, I'm going to create some dopamine, and then I'm going to actually study in the same manner, right? Like, some people like to, have a nice clean desk and you start the learning session in the same pattern so that the neurons are aligned to be in a learning mode, right? And a lot of people kind of get these tips and tricks from anybody that's ever taught you how to learn, right? Like, not taught you something, but taught you how to learn. That is one of the first things they say. You have to set up a rhythm for getting into the zone of learning, and that reason for that is because you start to flow in that dopaminergic state of learning. And so a icing on the cake that you could do, for example, is maybe get a little bit of sunlight or a little bit of nitric oxide production, or maybe you have a lot of melanin on your body, right? It's the end of summertime, so you can induce a hypoxic state with some special breathing to induce melanin to be turned into dopamine acutely, and then you start your studying session, right? So there are lots of things like that. Now, some people will say, well, can I take a supplement, right? Like L-Dopa is a very popular supplement for dopamine production, and the answer is you can take them. The real answer would be, will it create dopamine or not? And the answer is it may or may not, because of these different flows in the gene that I explained right here, right? So, for example, just landing at dopamine does not mean it's going to stay there, right? If you have, for example, you're really stressed, or you smoke, or you have absence of vitamin C, the L-Dopa can literally be turned into dopamine right here. This is where dopamine sits. And then the dopamine can immediately be turned into norepinephrine, right? So if you're in a stressed state, your dopamine isn't really helping you too much, and it's actually being dumped into noradrenaline or adrenaline. And then sometimes it even gets dumped to other receptors, depending on what's going on with your genes over here, right? The COMT gene, the MAOA gene, all of these genes influence if dopamine is going to be created at a fast rate and whether it's going to stay as dopamine, right? So I don't, and again, the main supplement out there is going to be L-Dopa or other herbs that turn into L-Dopa. That's really the only dopamine supplement that's going to be out there, is some form of L-Dopa or something that turns into L-Dopa. And I just don't find that they perform that well. The reason for that is you don't really have control of any of these other branches, right? And that's kind of how genes work. It's not supposed to be an on and off thing, because it's doing 5 different things, right? So the place where I've seen the most result is make sure your body's in the right environment. Make sure that you're consuming the baseline molecules, beta alanine and tyrosine, and make sure that you're making nitric oxide on a daily basis as much as possible, right? And again, those are low-hanging ways.
Does the inhibitor help?
Yeah, it will, to a certain degree, right? Like, being fitter, meaning you have good aerobic capabilities, will help. Being fitter because you can lift more weight may or may not, because it comes down to aerobic capabilities.
That's for sure. And what you just described is how Tony Robbins runs his events. It's basically, we are teaching you how to think critically, how to dissect your brain in a certain manner. And then every single time you finish this way of thinking, you have to reward yourself. It's either power pose or incantation or something powerful to engrave that thinking pattern. So, and you'll sometimes do it an hour, 2 hours in a row until everyone gets it. This is how I need to make sure that I start executing on my ideas. I start thinking critically. I start being more like energetic, because we both know it's not about being motivated. It's about having the reason to do stuff, and we can pull them out.
Well, and I mean, it goes even further, right? Like you've told me in the past, and I know that he does this, is at the event, it's cold. It's cold on purpose, because cold will make nitric oxide if you let it, right? Like if you're dressed like an Eskimo, no nitric oxide is going to be made. But if you're in just a t-shirt and the temperature in that room is 55 degrees, guess what you're doing? You're making nitric oxide. That means that if you have beta alanine and tyrosine in your system, you're going to be making dopamine. He's trying to teach you how to think and how to execute on ideas. If you have a high level of dopamine, you're going to be much more successful at executing what he's asking you to do. You see what I mean? And not only that, you're going to be very successful at, after I've done it several times for a couple of hours, I actually kind of feel the effect, and I can actually tune into, oh yes, this is exactly how I need to do it. And you can recreate it even when you're not at that event. But say you're somebody who doesn't get engaged, you're not in the mood, right? You're completely clothed, you're not exposed to any cold anymore, you're not feeling the cold. You're going to have a completely different experience, because dopamine also because it's a timing molecule, slows down time, right? Like I'm literally saying exactly and meaning exactly what I mean. It slows down your experience of time. So everybody that's a sports aficionado or has done sports has at some point probably experienced that slow down time effect when you are really in the zone. Dopamine is really flowing. It's like, oh man, I did all these things. It felt like it took an hour or it felt like it was 10 minutes. And literally you watch the video back and it was less than 1 minute. Right, all of your actions took less than 1 minute, but you felt like you were doing it for a lot longer because you had
It reminds
a
me when I
slowdown
thought
of
when I used
time
to play
dilation.
basketball.
Yep. Yeah. That is a large amount of dopamine being produced. And like I said, dopamine will be produced from melanin in a stressful event. So
Mm.
something that I've noticed from traveling to third world countries where, a lot of people are shirtless, and a lot of people are very melanated. And one thing I notice is that they take risks literally every day. They'll ride on the back of a truck hanging off of it, smoking a cigarette, right? Like with their bag on their shoulder, riding down the street at 60 miles an hour. Not joking. I've seen that all the time,
Yep.
all the time. Why do you think they survive? Is because they're creating so much dopamine anytime they get stressed. I literally have seen a guy on the back of a truck in El Salvador holding pallets of wood down. A pallet came up. He it was about to rip him off the thing. He just let it go and let it fly off in a split second. He knew exactly what to do and climbed to the other side. Right. That was his daily event. It probably happened to him before. You see what I'm saying? The level of dopamine that he was able to flex in that moment is what saved his life. His reaction time was that of any elite athlete. And it's because he can flex dopamine from melanin instantly because he has a high level of aerobic capacity and he's out in the sun all day long, right? Dopamine is incredibly tied to your environment. It doesn't mean it's the sole provider because you have backup systems because dopamine is so important to keep things running. Like I said, if you have a dopamine creation problem, eventually you run into dementia, right? Your brain starts to fall apart. So that is how important dopamine is. So people are right to talk about dopamine a lot, but they don't give it nearly enough credit and they make it way too simplistic. Oh, dopamine is a reward hormone. Kind of not. The effects of having a lot of dopamine rewards you, but dopamine is more of a survival, pattern recognition, motor unit improvement, brain patterning improving molecule. It does a whole lot. But a lot of people do not engage in. So let me go back to this because this is very important for modern living humans is this. A lot of people will neglect these first few steps because of the nitric oxide production. So you're not actually making an abundance of this first little step, this L-DOPA. So the
And
way
again,
that most
before you carry on, I would like to kind of emphasize that we are kind of on a page, hey, make sure you get your protein early in the day instead of solely relying on fasting and all the magic you heard about it. Even though now we have finally studies coming out that say, you know what? No, it's just calorie restriction. You're eating less food, you're eating less garbage food, you're experiencing less inflammation. That's why you're feeling better. There's no magic around it really.
Yeah.
So phenylalanine, it's high quality protein, and then nitric oxide, right?
Yep, nitric oxide in the form of either cold exposure in the morning or morning UV light. Right now, I'm going to take you to another slide that's a little bit more simplistic right here. And this is what I'm talking about. So we saw that we'll just focus on the first top. So here's the amino acids that we're talking about. Then there's the precursors and then DOPA right here, okay? Most people miss the photosynthesis effect, which is the nitric oxide production, okay? Most people are actually creating their dopamine right over here, not from L-DOPA, because most people are actually functioning low on the thyroid molecules. Remember, these also create the thyroid molecules and flavonoids before they create the L-DOPA. So most people, dopamine is actually being moved in the opposite direction. You're taking your melanin and turning it into dopamine, or you're taking adrenaline and noradrenaline and moving into dopamine. It can move both directions, right? And now when I say melanin, this goes for even white people or Swedish people, because your mitochondrial makeup, right, whether you're fair skinned or darker skinned and all the variations in between, all of us have melanin internally, right? And that's another thing people don't understand. You have melanin literally everywhere inside of you, in your guts, inside your brain, inside your esophagus, at all of your esophages or sphincters. You have melanin inside of just about everywhere. I have a picture of where it's all located, just about everywhere. So internal melanin is what's being turned into dopamine. The melanin in your cochlea, the melanin in your iris, the melanin in your brain. Those are the things that are being fluxed for most normal humans in the modern world into dopamine, because you're not actually doing what most people would want you to do, or what nature wants you to do, I should say, which is getting a lot of sunlight with a lot of these amino acids in the bloodstream to create dopamine at the raw level. You're going from raw product to finished product dopamine. You're actually recycling it. Most people are recycling their melanin or depleting their melanin to turn it into dopamine. A simple way to think about this is a little hack that I've suggested sometimes, which is this. You actively make a lot of melanin, right? You spend a lot of time outside and stuff like that. And then any time that you need to get a lot of stuff done, whether it's computer work, whether it's exercising, etc., going in and turning on a lot of bright lights for about 10 to 15 minutes before engaging in that activity will deplete dopamine everywhere. And when it does that, it will create a lot, or sorry, it will deplete melanin, and it will create a lot of dopamine immediately in that 15-minute window. So
And
if you're
we
somebody
talked about in some previous videos about, like, whilst that type of environment might not be healthy, it might make you exclusively creative for time being.
a given period of time, yes, absolutely, because you're going to fix a lot of dopamine. And I tend to use it for exercising, for like very important workouts. What I will do is I will do a combination of two things. I will get a little bit cold, about 55 degrees, and I will do it under a really bright blue LED lights. No, not very long, 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes at the most. And then I'll get dressed, I'll go in and have a workout, and everything will be firing on all cylinders, because I flexed a lot of dopamine right before this, and now I've exposed myself to the stimulus that I want to have. And a lot of people actually kind of have this hack and know about this hack, that take Adderall and Ritalin, because let's face it, not everybody that's taking it is taking it because they are prescribed it. They're taking it for studying and stuff like that. People have noticed that if they take their whatever it's their medication, and they take it not before the activity, because there's some lag time, right? But they start studying and then they take it while they're studying, so it hits them while they're studying. That's when they learn the best, because if they take it before, they don't really know when exactly it's going to kick in. So it might kick in before the studying happens, so they might actually learn incorrectly, right? Whether, depending on what you're studying, right? If it's a physical performance or a mental performance. So you see what I'm saying? Like, there's a lot of things kind of involved there.
So before I let you kind of off, what you discussed there, I got out of it that bleaching your backside is probably not a good idea. And another thing is, I got a follow-up question about what are some medical interventions and when would they be needed for somebody who has issues with dopamine?
Well, so we talked a little bit about Adderall and Ritalin. Those would be people with ADHD. So those that have I wouldn't say a dopamine deficiency quite yet, but they have a dopamine aberrance, right? Their dopamine goes high and low and all over the place. And so that's why they can get distracted and pull different ways, because they're not focusing on patterning, right? You give them a little bit extra dopamine, all of a sudden they can focus in, because now they can essentially prune neurons more efficiently, right? So that's an obvious medical intervention for a dopamine type problem, okay? Another thing would be, I would say, even as far as, hey, if dementia runs in your family, or if you have dementia, you may look into supplementing some synthetic dopamine, or exploiting your environment to make as much dopamine as possible, which would be the long-term solution. So those are, again, other ways to do that. And then just leaning into a lot of the things that I talked about as far as like, hey, getting outside or exploiting yourself to a hypoxic environment of some level right before trying to learn something or execute something physical so that you can create more dopamine. And then assessing that, hey, did you create enough? Did it feel really good? And then finding ways to create and cultivate your own dopamine all the time. One of the main ones is limiting blue light screen time aberrantly, like all the time, because blue light screen time, right, phone or computer, those are creating dopamine right then and there. So even if you made a bunch earlier in the day, you're going to deplete it just by sitting at your laptop. Is that useful time or not of your dopamine depletion processes, right?
Right.
Like a lot of people, you don't understand this little part. You're always going to deplete dopamine all the time because you're using it all the time. Some activities will deplete dopamine unnecessarily. For example, checking Facebook. Checking Facebook shouldn't be a dopamine depletion effect. The problem is the screen that you're interacting with is going to deplete dopamine irrelevant of whether you're checking something important or something sub-important. That is a crucial thing. Light plays a huge role in depleting dopamine from melanin, probably the most out of any of them. So
It
that's one of the
almost
most,
sounds like you are listing a checklist for dopamine optimization.
yeah, yeah,
But so it would be check if your nutrition is correct in sense of you're consuming high quality protein, right?
mm-hmm,
Then daily habits, then your fitness levels and maybe amount of muscle you carry, and then maybe your social events. Do you do them inside and outside? Could that be
yeah,
kind of the right idea? How
yeah,
somebody reflect on themselves? Hey, you know what? By the way, I work a lot of time in office. I have somebody that I work specifically that he goes to the gym early in the morning before sun rises, then comes back home, works in his basement office all day, and then spends some afternoon with his family inside the house. And then lo and behold, all his blood tests came back all over the place.
mm-hmm,
So, and he's tired all the time and he's taking all the supplements he wants just to keep working, so to speak.
mm-hmm,
Whereas according to this checklist, it would be, and he fasts. According to this
right.
checklist, it would be you're doing everything to make yourself feel the way you feel.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're violating every single one of those things on the checklist, I would expect, I mean, you can do that for a little while, right?
Mm.
A couple months, probably going to be fine. 6 months, probably not. A year, definitely not, right? Like it's just one of those things where these checklists are to get you back on track. And once you get back on track, hopefully you're making enough dopamine that you can recognize the pattern of, oh, these things create the dopamine and cultivate the dopamine, and these other things that I do deplete it. And then you start choosing, hey, am I in a time of life or time of day or time of week where I want to deplete it and it's totally fine? Or do I want to be cultivating it? Right. Again, you have to make that choice because it's going to happen whether you want it to or not. But now you have choices of when to deplete and when to cultivate by understanding these. I don't even call them complex. They're just, this is how it works. Right.
Before I let you go, last question, because we are so now engraved into remote working, does wearing blue light blocking glasses somehow alleviate the
It
bleed?
does. It does. It helps a lot. Blue light blocking glasses, being grounded. Ideally, if you have a window next to your workstation that you can open, that those things, those little checklists right there will go a long way and not depleting dopamine unnecessarily because of your work.
Awesome. Thank you, David. I'm mindful of your time. I'll see you next video, but this has been really insightful and appreciate your time.
Awesome, man.